Sacraments are what you do in church. What you do at home is something else. Cooking and sewing and running the whistle sweeper and eating and sleeping and praying and scrubbing yourself are not sacraments. When you are little and ugly, somebody carries you in church on a pillow, and you come out a child of God and inheritor of the kingdom of heaven. They pour water on your head, and that's a sacrament. When you are 12, you walk back in yourself with your best dress and shoes on, and your new prayer book your mother buys you, and you walk up to the bishop, and he stands up, and you kneel down, and he mashes on your head, and you are an Episcopal. Then you are supposed to increase in spirit. Then everybody kisses you, and that's a sacrament. Only I left out the bread and the wine. That's a sacrament too. I tasted some of that bread in the choir room, and it tasted just like my goldfish wafers. Then, when you are married, you go back to church dressed up like you never were before in all your days. Somebody sings, "Oh, promise me," and your sweetheart is waiting up by the preacher if he doesn't forget to come. She bought her a new bath suit with a big sailor collar and ruffles around the knees. And she married Dr. Townsend. And I like him. He is handsome. That old absent-minded bridegroom was always saying to me, "Little girl, isn't it time you were going home?" And I had only just gotten there, and I barely had sat myself down in the parlor. And then you get carried back in the church again, but you are dead, and it takes 6 people to lift you, and everybody cries, and that's the last sacrament you are going to get.
If we don't know the pronunciation of a word or something like that, we just look at each other and we say, "Ann will know." Because I was up reading one time and I mispronounced something. And I continue on and I felt something on my neck. And I picked it off and it looked like a ladybug. And so I held it. I didn't want to, so I just held it in my hand. And that's when the choir sat on the other side. And I started to walk down and Ann grabbed my hand. And you wouldn't look at her, but she's got a really ferocious grip. And she's squeezing my hand. Telling me,
my younger days.
Yeah, telling me, "No, it's pronounced this way and that way." Okay. So the bottom line is, I learned the pronunciation. My hand's okay, and the ladybug was okay.
The story begins how the rhinoceros got his skin. Once upon a time, on an uninhabited island, on the shores of the Red Sea, there lived a Parsee, from whose hat the rays of the sun were reflected in more than oriental splendor. And the Parsee lived by the Red Sea with nothing but his hat and his knife and a cooking stove of the kind that you must not particularly never touch. He's talking to his children, you understand. And one day he took flour and water and currants and plums and sugar and things, and made himself one cake which was 2 feet across and 3 feet thick. It was indeed a superior comestible. In those days, the rhinoceros skin fit him quite tight. There were no wrinkles in it anywhere. He looked exactly like a Noah's Ark rhinoceros, but of course, much bigger. All the same, he had no manners then, and has no manners now, and he never will have any manners. He said, "Oh," and the Parsee left that cake and climbed to the top of a palm tree with nothing on but his hat, from which the rays of the sun were always reflected in more than oriental splendor. And the rhinoceros upset the oil stove, with his nose, and the cake rolled on the sand, and he spiked that cake on the horn of his nose, and he ate it. And he went away, waving his tail to the desolate and exclusively uninhabited. Then the Parsee came down from his palm tree and put the stove on its legs and recited the following sloka, which, as you have not heard, I will now proceed to relate. Them that takes cakes, which the Parsee man bakes, makes dreadful mistakes. Presently the Parsee came by and found the skin, and he smiled one smile that ran all around his face 2 times. Then he danced 3 times around the skin and rubbed his hands. Then he went to the camp and filled his hat with cake crumbs. For the Parsee never ate anything but cake and never swept out his camp. He took that skin and he shook that skin and he scrubbed that skin and he rubbed that skin just as full of old, dry, stale, tickly cake crumbs and some burnt currants as ever it could possibly hold. Then he climbed to the top of his palm tree and waited for the rhinoceros to come out of the water and put it on. And the rhinoceros did. He buttoned it up with 3 buttons, and it tickled like cake crumbs in bed. Then he wanted to scratch, but it made it worse. And then he lay down on the sand and rolled and rolled and rolled, and every time he rolled, the cake crumbs tickled him worse and worse and worse. Then he ran to the palm tree and rubbed and rubbed and rubbed himself against it. He rubbed so much and so hard that he rubbed his skin into a great fold over his shoulder, and another fold underneath where the buttons used to be, but he rubbed the buttons off. And he rubbed some more folds over his legs, and it spoiled his temper, but it didn't make it the least difference to the cake crumbs. They were inside his skin, and they tickled. These cake crumbs in his skin were still tickling him. So he went home very angry indeed and horribly scratchy. And from that day to this, every rhinoceros has great folds in his skin and a very bad temper, all on account of the cake crumbs inside.